her final years, Madame Palatine's heart beat slower and heavier, like it was carrying the weight of Versailles itself. No one heard the pain beneath her laughter. She mocked the world to hide the breath she could barely take. At 70, heart failure and breathless nights consumed her massive frame, but not her truth. Even as her body decayed, her voice, honest, defiant, unfiltered, kept echoing through the marble halls that once silenced her. In the autumn of 1671, the people of Heidelberg lined the streets to watch a procession unlike any other. Carriages draped in silk and gold rolled through the narrow alleys, bearing gifts from France and guards in bright uniforms. Among them sat a 19-year-old bride whose face was pale with restraint. Elizabeth Charlotte, Princess Palatine, soon to become Madame Duchess d'Orléans. To her subjects, she was a symbol of alliance. To herself, she was a sacrifice dressed in brocade. France and the Palatinate had spent years oscillating between fragile friendship and quiet hostility. Louis XIV, the Sun King, sought to secure his eastern frontier through marriage rather than bloodshed. The young Princess of Heidelberg, with her impeccable lineage and lack of political ambition, was the perfect candidate. Her father agreed at once. For him, it meant protection. For her, it meant exile. When she left Germany, Liselotte carried with her a single chest of personal belongings, a few books, some hunting gloves, and a small portrait of her mother. As she crossed the border into France, the guards bowed, and her carriage wheels sank into the soft, manicured soil of a world that would soon devour her. At the border, she was forced to undergo the ritual of transformation, the entrée en France. Her German attendants were dismissed. Her clothes, even the undergarments, were stripped away and replaced by French silks. Her German Bible was taken, her language forbidden. By the time she reached Paris, she was already half erased. They called her Madame now, wife to Philippe, Duke of Orléans, younger brother of Louis XIV. Versailles celebrated the match with fireworks and music. Courtiers whispered about her rustic manners and heavy frame, but the king seemed satisfied. The alliance was sealed. Her first encounter with Philippe was one of those cruelly polite scenes that history often forgets. He was elegant, perfumed, and distant, his gestures too perfect, his smile too rehearsed. Liselotte, who had spent her life among hunters and scholars, found him unreal. His hands, gloved and jeweled, trembled faintly when he touched hers. Later that night, she would write in her diary that his eyes looked past me, as though seeking someone else in the air. That someone else was the Chevalier de Lorraine, Philippe's longtime companion, a man of charm and arrogance who ruled the Duke's heart and household alike. Versailles tolerated their relationship because Philippe was the king's brother, and scandal had become part of the palace's rhythm. But for Liselotte, it was a wound that never closed. On the day of the wedding, she walked through the chapel at Saint-Cloud, surrounded by candles and perfumed air that felt suffocating. The king himself watched, smiling, while priests intoned the Latin vows. Liselotte repeated the words mechanically, her mind drifting to the forests of Heidelberg. When she looked at her husband, she saw not a partner, but a wall. After the ceremony, they dined in splendor. Silver platters overflowed with meats and sauces she found inedible. The courtiers praised her appearance, her grace, her supposed joy, but their eyes were cold. It was not her they celebrated, but what she represented: peace, diplomacy, the pleasing illusion of harmony between nations. That night, when the festivities faded, she was led to the bridal chamber. The bed was vast, covered in embroidered lilies of France. Philippe appeared briefly, exchanged a few words, and left soon after. The door closed behind him with a quiet click that sounded, to her, like a lock turning. She lay awake in the perfumed darkness, listening to distant music from the gardens and wondering what kind of life could begin with so much silence. The next morning, her chambermaids addressed her as Madame. The title carried grandeur but also weight. In Versailles, titles were cages gilded with flattery. Every gesture, every word, every breath was observed, recorded, judged. To be Madame meant to be watched forever. In the following weeks, she tried to adjust. She studied the etiquette of the French court, how to bow, how to walk, how to speak with graceful hypocrisy. She learned that at Versailles, truth was not a virtue, but a weapon that could destroy its wielder. She also learned that kindness was weakness, that smiles often concealed daggers. She missed her dogs. Her laughter became rare. Her appetite faded. But she began to write long letters to friends and relatives in Germany. It was through these letters that her soul survived the suffocation of Versailles. They would one day number in the tens of thousands, chronicling not only her personal despair, but the hidden machinery of the most powerful court in Europe. In one early letter, she confessed, "I have married not a man, but a system. He does not love me, nor I him, but we are both chained to the same illusion." And yet, there was no bitterness in her tone, only a weary curiosity. She observed Versailles the way a naturalist studies a dangerous animal. The endless rituals fascinated her. The waking of the king, the meals performed before the eyes of the court, the bowing, the gossip, the obsession with appearance. "Everything here," she wrote, "is form without soul." Philippe, meanwhile, continued his life of extravagance and indulgence. The Chevalier de Lorraine dined at their table, occupied their salons, and whispered orders to servants as though he were the true master of the household. Liselott endured it with grim dignity. She did not cry in public. She did not rebel. She simply retreated inward, into her writing and her memory of the Rhineland. It was in this quiet endurance that her strength began to reveal itself. Versailles expected her to become brittle, vain, and petty like the rest. But she remained earthy, almost peasant-like in her simplicity. She laughed loudly, ate heartily, and mocked the pomp of the courtiers to their faces. They called her La Grosse Allemande, the fat German woman, and laughed behind her back. But she laughed too, because she saw through their cruelty. In one letter, she remarked, "They can say what they please. I prefer being laughed at for being honest than praised for being false." That defiance would define her entire existence in France. Her marriage to Philippe was never a union of hearts, only a treaty between two nations written in the language of deceit. Yet, within that sterile arrangement, Liselott forged her own kind of power, the power of observation, the power of truth. In a palace that worshipped lies, she became the quiet historian of its moral decay. Her exile, she would later say, was not to another country, but to another kind of humanity altogether. And though she did not yet know it, this young bride, stripped of her language and her faith, had already begun the lifelong work that would make her immortal, the work of bearing witness. She had not chosen her destiny, but she would choose how to tell it. Elizabeth Charlotte of the Palatinate, known to history as Madame Palatine or simply Liselott, was born on May 27, 1652, in Heidelberg, within the cold stone walls of Heidelberg Castle. The air of her homeland was sharp and bracing, heavy with the scent of pine and smoke. It shaped her early life as much as her lineage did. She was the daughter of Charles the Louis, Elector Palatine, a pragmatic ruler of a ruined land after the 30 Years' War, and Charlotte of Hesse-Kassel, a woman of fierce intellect and stubborn pride. From them, Lieselot inherited two things that would both save and doom her: a razor-edged honesty and a refusal to bow to falsehood. In the smoky halls of Heidelberg, she was not raised like a fragile princess. Her father, hardened by the devastations that had torn the Rhineland apart, believed in plain speech and a hard truth. Her mother, quick-tempered and sharp-tongued, despised vanity and the courtly masks that women were forced to wear. Between them, Lieselotte grew into a child who spoke whatever she thought, even when it stung. Servants whispered that she was too honest for her own good. She laughed at etiquette, mocked pomp, and preferred long walks in the cold to embroidery or gossip. She learned languages early: German, French, Latin, but not the art of deception. In Heidelberg, that was seen as virtue. In Versailles, it would be seen as a crime. As a child, she watched her father's court try to recover from the wreckage of war. The Palatinate was scarred, villages burned, people starving. From her window, she could see peasants struggling through snow with bundles of firewood on their backs, their faces gray with exhaustion. She would later recall these images when she wrote about France, a nation obsessed with gold and glitter while peasants starved in its fields. Her heart had been molded early by hardship and by the German plainness of thought that would forever set her apart from the silken courtiers of Louis XIV. By adolescence, Lieselot had grown into a woman with a tall, strong frame and a blunt demeanor. She was not delicate, nor was she trained to hide discomfort behind charm. Her laughter was loud, her handwriting vigorous, her temper quick. She loved dogs, horses, hunting, and freedom. Her father adored her, but knew her nature was ill-suited for the political marriages that defined the fates of European princesses. Still, in an age when women's wills were seldom their own, her destiny was never hers to shape. When envoys from France began seeking a bride for Philippe d'Orléans, the younger brother of Louis XIV, her name appeared on the list. She was Protestant, a dangerous flaw in Catholic France, but her father agreed to have her converted. For him, it was a chance to secure peace with the most powerful monarch in Europe. For her, it was an exile disguised as honor. She was 19, too young to understand that a political marriage could be a slow form of death. Before her departure, she rode alone through the woods surrounding Heidelberg Castle. The leaves were falling, and the Rhine shimmered in the distance like a silver blade cutting through mist. She paused on a hill and looked back at her home, whispering to a maid beside her, "They send me into a world where I must never say what I think." The maid did not answer. There was nothing to say. That night, her mother brushed her hair and warned her softly, "You must learn silence. Versailles is built on it." But silence had never been Lieselot's virtue. She was born into a land of blunt words and honest hearts, and the idea of suppressing her thoughts felt like suffocating. Still, she nodded and pretended to agree, the first small lie of her life. As her carriage rolled away from Heidelberg through the fog of dawn, she pressed her hand to the window glass and whispered to herself, "I will not change." It was both a promise and a curse. The French court would not understand this woman who preferred truth to beauty, simplicity to luxury, sincerity to performance. They would call her brusque, vulgar, unpolished. But history would come to see her differently, as one of the few souls in Versailles who still spoke like a human being among masks. In the coming years, she would live surrounded by deception, courtiers who smiled as they plotted, women who flirted as they betrayed, men who pledged loyalty with poisoned tongues. But here, in her youth, in the gray light of the Rhine, Lieselotte was still untouched by that theater of lies. She was still a girl who believed that words could be clean, that hearts could be true, that loyalty still meant something. The irony of her life would be that her greatest virtue, her sincerity, would become her lifelong torment. Versailles was not a place for truth. It was a place for choreography. Every movement, every glance, every breath was part of an endless ballet of manipulation. And she, the German princess who spoke her mind, would stumble through that dance like a storm through silk curtains. Yet, in her letters, written decades later when her heart had grown tired and her body swollen with age, one can still hear the echo of this young woman from Heidelberg, unbroken, mocking hypocrisy with a smile. "I cannot lie," she once wrote, "and that is my tragedy." She was right. The child who once laughed under the cold winds of the Palatinate would one day find herself suffocating in the gilded air of Versailles. Her honesty, forged in the ashes of a ruined land, would clash with the gold and perfume of a palace that demanded silence. And though history would remember her as Madame Palatine, the sharp-tongued sister-in-law of the Sun King, beneath the layers of mockery and scandal lay the same heart that had once watched her homeland burn, refusing to forget who she truly was. The tragedy of Lieselotte began long before her death. It began the moment she promised herself she would never change, and then stepped into a world that punished her for keeping that promise. From the moment Lieselotte entered the gilded chambers of the Palais Royal, she realized that her marriage was not meant for love, nor even companionship, but for appearances. The Duke of Orléans, Philippe, younger brother to the Sun King, lived surrounded by mirrors, perfumes, and men who adored him. He was brilliant in conversation, dazzling in dress, and utterly uninterested in women. Versailles had long whispered of his inclinations, but whispers meant little in a palace built on hypocrisy. Philippe's relationship with the Chevalier de Lorraine was no secret. It was an institution. The Chevalier was handsome, cunning, and cruelly amused by Lieselotte's presence. He called her the German cow in private, mocking her honesty and her lack of intrigue. Philippe, ever eager to please his companion, often laughed along. In her letters, Lieselotte would later write, "I am not married to a man, but to a shadow that adores another." Her wedding ring became a shackle of diplomacy. Nights were cold and silent. The bed she shared with Philippe remained as untouched as the treaties between their nations. He spent his evenings at masked balls, surrounded by his circle of favorites, while she stayed behind with her dogs and her thoughts. At first, she tried to reach him. She spoke to him with the same directness that had once impressed her father's court. But in France, truth was indecent. Philippe found her openness exhausting. "You speak as if we were peasants," he told her once, adjusting a jeweled cufflink. "At court, we do not say what we mean." That became the motto of her new life. Never say what you mean, yet she could not adapt. Lieselotte's spirit refused to bend to the invisible laws of Versailles. She laughed too loudly, walked too freely, and showed too much sincerity. Women of the court wore smiles like veils. She wore her heart on her sleeve. In the salons, her blunt remarks scandalized the nobles. In the gardens, her German accent became the butt of jokes. Still, Louis XIV tolerated her, perhaps even admired her in his own distant way. She amused him, Her frankness was refreshing among the poisonous flattery of courtiers. He once said, "Madame speaks the truth as if it were a game." But he kept her at arm's length, like one keeps a wild animal behind glass. Over time, Liselotte learned to turn her isolation into armor. She befriended the few who valued honesty, the Duchess of Montpensier, the aging dowager who had seen the same corruption wrought through the court, a few ladies-in-waiting who pitied her, and the servants who adored her for treating them like people. In the quiet of her rooms, she began the ritual that would define her legacy: writing letters. Every morning, after the endless ceremonies of greeting and meal rituals, she would retire to her desk and write to her father, to her Aunt Sophia of Hanover, to old friends in Heidelberg. Her letters became the mirror of Versailles that Versailles never wanted to see. Through her ink, she chronicled a kingdom ruled by vanity and rot. She wrote of ladies fainting for attention, of nobles selling secrets for jewels, of a king who measured virtue by obedience. Her tone was biting but never cruel. She observed more than she condemned. To her, truth itself was justice. Still, her loneliness was immense. Her husband's affection belonged wholly to the Chevalier de Lorraine, whose influence grew monstrous. The Chevalier controlled Philippe's finances, household, and even the servants assigned to Liselotte. When she complained, Philippe dismissed her as jealous. "You Germans," he said with a sneer, "know nothing of refinement." That word, refinement, haunted her. In France, it meant deceit elevated to art. One evening, after a particularly humiliating dinner in which the Chevalier openly mocked her accent, Liselotte returned to her chambers and locked the door. She sat by the fire, tearing a silk handkerchief apart thread by thread until the hearth was filled with white ash. In that moment, she understood that her life would not be measured in joy, but in endurance. She would not love Philippe. She would not change him, but she could outlast him. In time, she began to find power in the smallest rebellions. She hunted in the forests when other ladies embroidered. She wrote long, uncensored letters while others whispered behind fans. She told jokes about herself before others could. And she refused, absolutely refused, to bow to Lorraine's mockery. "They may laugh," she wrote once, "but I laugh louder." Her humor became her shield, her defiance her disguise. It was this mixture of wit and resilience that earned her the reluctant respect of Louis XIV. The king often invited her to his private suppers, where her blunt observations made even him smile. "Madame," he said once, "you are the only person at Versailles who has never tried to deceive me." Her answer was simple. "That is because, sire, I have no ambition worth lying for." It was a dangerous truth, and yet the king seemed to admire it. The years passed, and Liselotte's marriage remained what it had always been, a stage without a script. She and Philippe lived parallel lives, he in his glittering world of courtiers and lovers, she in her quiet chambers of letters and laughter. And though she was surrounded by noise, she lived in silence. The world saw her as the dutiful duchess, always smiling in portraits beside her husband. But beneath the powdered wig and velvet gowns, her heart was slowly learning a different rhythm, one not of love or contentment, but of survival. She once wrote to her aunt, "There are worse fates than being unloved. One can live without love, but not without truth. And I would rather die of truth than suffocate under lies." That sentence, half lament, half declaration, defined her destiny. In a court where women existed to adorn, amuse, or betray, Liselotte became something unprecedented. A woman who neither seduced nor conspired. but remembered. Her pen preserved the reality Versailles tried to bury under marble and gold. Her marriage, loveless as it was, gave her access to the most secret heart of France, and her letters turned that access into immortality. But for now, in the early years of her union, she could not know that. She only knew the ache of being unseen, the slow humiliation of being tolerated rather than loved, and the endless nights where her husband's laughter echoed from the rooms next door, a laughter that did not belong to her. And so, every dawn, she wrote. Not to complain, but to exist. Because in Versailles, truth could not be spoken aloud. It could only be written in ink. Versailles, the palace that glittered like a jewel and rotted like fruit. To the world, it was the heart of civilization. To Lieselot, it was a theater of vanity where truth had been exiled. The first time she entered the Hall of Mirrors, she was struck not by its beauty, but by its emptiness. Hundreds of reflections, her face multiplied endlessly. Yet none of them seemed real. That hall, she would later write, was the perfect symbol of life at court. Everything is reflection, nothing is substance. The courtiers adored appearances. Their smiles were painted, their conversations rehearsed. Every gesture was a calculation, every friendship a transaction. To survive at Versailles, one had to learn the choreography of deceit. A dance Lieselot refused to learn. Her German bluntness was seen as barbaric. She spoke plainly when others spoke in riddles, laughed when others whispered, and refused to feign interest in trivial gossip. The French ladies called her La Sauvage du Rhin, the savage from the Rhine. They mocked her large frame, her plain dresses, her lack of perfume. Some imitated her heavy accent to amuse the king's mistresses. And yet, behind her ridicule, they feared her, because she saw through them. In a world ruled by pretense, Lieselot's honesty was an act of rebellion. She refused to flirt, refused to gossip, refused to hate. When women competed for the king's attention, she rolled her eyes and returned to her hunting dogs. Better to chase deer, she once wrote, than to chase favor. But Versailles did not forgive those who rejected its rituals. Every day was an invisible battle, not of swords, but of smiles. She was excluded from secret gatherings, left out of conversations, subtly mocked in salons. The Chevalier de Lorraine spread rumors that she despised France, that she mocked the king in private. The truth was simpler. She mocked hypocrisy, not France. To defend herself, she began to write even more. Her letters became her weapon. Witty, merciless, vivid. In them, she described Versailles not as history would later polish it, but as it truly was, a nest of envy wrapped in gold. If the devil ever built himself a palace, she wrote, he would copy Versailles. Her words were her revenge. Still, the isolation cut deep. She missed her homeland, the cold rivers, the forests, the sound of real laughter. She missed speaking German, eating dark bread, walking freely without worrying about etiquette. At Versailles, even grief had a proper posture. When her first child fell ill, she wept openly in the chapel, an act considered unrefined. The courtiers whispered that Madame lacked noblesse. She ignored them, but that word stayed with her like a bruise. To them, she was always the other. Too honest to trust, too foreign to love, too human to belong. Louis XIV, though rarely cruel to her, saw her as a curiosity, a rough diamond meant to amuse him. He enjoyed her letters, her stories, her dry humor. Sometimes he summoned her simply to hear her complain. "You make me laugh, Madame," he said once, "even when you are angry." Her reply, delivered with a bow, was sharp. "Sire, that is because I am German. We laugh when we wish to cry." Behind the sarcasm, there was exhaustion. Every morning began the same. Hours of ceremony. Endless waiting in gilded corridors, formal meals where no one ate, and polite lies passed like wine. Versailles was not a palace, but a clockwork machine. Beautiful, suffocating, and mercilessly precise. Liselott learned to disappear within it. She found comfort in her dogs, her books, her correspondence. She walked the gardens alone at dawn, when the dew still clung to marble statues and the air was momentarily honest. In those quiet hours, she could breathe. She often paused by the fountains, watching her reflection ripple and distort, and thought of Heidelberg, her lost home, where water had meant life, not luxury. In one letter she confessed, "I live among masks, and I no longer remember what an unpainted face looks like." The king's mistresses came and went. Louise de la Vallière, Madame de Montespan, Madame de Maintenon, each wielding influence for a season, each replaced when beauty faded. Liselott observed them with a mix of pity and scorn. "They live like flowers in vases," she wrote, "admired until they wilt, then thrown away." She, at least, had chosen to be rooted, even if the soil was hostile. But the hostility grew subtler, colder. The courtiers smiled while excluding her. Her letters were sometimes intercepted. Her husband's indifference hardened into disdain. The Chevalier de Lorraine made sure she was isolated, even from her children's tutors. Yet, Liselott endured. Her endurance became a kind of quiet rebellion. She did not seek power, only integrity. When others sought to destroy her reputation, she met them with laughter. "I cannot be ruined," she told a friend, "for I have nothing to lose." And indeed, that was her strength. She had no ambitions to protect, no secrets to conceal, no lovers to expose. She could afford honesty, and in a world like Versailles, honesty was the rarest luxury of all. Still, she paid dearly for it. At court dinners, the conversation often turned deliberately toward Germany, just to mock her roots. When she remained silent, they called her dull. When she answered, they called her coarse. She once wrote bitterly, "Here, truth is vulgar, and stupidity is grace." As the years passed, her loneliness deepened into something quieter, resignation, perhaps, or wisdom. She began to see Versailles not as a punishment, but as a lesson. Every lie, every betrayal, every false smile became material for her pen. Her letters were not confessions anymore. They were chronicles. And while the courtiers laughed at her, posterity would remember them only through her eyes. By the time she realized this, she had stopped longing to be understood. She no longer tried to fit in. Instead, she watched, like an anthropologist studying a dying civilization. "They call me rough," she wrote, "but at least I am real." The irony was perfect. The woman Versailles mocked for her plainness would one day become its most truthful voice. And as the chandeliers glowed and the waltzes played and the masks smiled, Liselott of the Palatinate, the lonely German duchess, quietly began her transformation from a forgotten foreign bride into the only honest witness Versailles ever had. The war that came in the 1680s tore through Liselotta's life like a fire through dry grass. In 1688, the armies of her own husband's nation, France, invaded the Palatinate, her homeland, under the orders of Louis XIV. The justification was political. The king claimed inheritance rights through Liselott herself. But to her, the reason was irrelevant. The result was devastation. Villages burned. Churches were plundered. Heidelberg, the city of her birth, was reduced to ash. When she heard the news, Liselott collapsed. For hours, she refused to speak. When she finally did, her voice was cold and trembling. "They have burned my cradle in the name of my marriage." It was the cruelest irony of her life. Her existence as a diplomatic bride, meant to unite two nations, had become the very reason one was destroyed. Versailles rejoiced in victory. She grieved in silence. While the court celebrated the expansion of France, Liselotte wandered through the gardens of Saint-Cloud like a ghost, clutching a letter from her Aunt Sophia of Hanover that described the smoke rising over the Rhine. "My dear Liselotte," her aunt had written, "your beautiful Heidelberg is gone." Gone, a word that cut more deeply than any insult Versailles had ever thrown at her. She begged Louis XIV for mercy, writing to him directly, pleading that her family's ancestral lands be spared. The king replied with polite detachment. "Madame," he said, "wars do not wait for tears." For the rest of her life, Liselotte would never forgive him for that. The destruction of her homeland split her soul in two. In France, she was the foreign duchess, the unrefined German who would never quite belong. In Germany, she was now seen as the Frenchman's wife, the woman whose marriage had brought ruin to the Rhine. She belonged nowhere. In her letters, she described her torment with stark clarity. "I am too French for my own people, and too German for these. I am like a coin that cannot be spent in either country." Exile became not a place, but a state of being. She had been living in France for nearly 2 decades by then. Her children were French. Her language, reluctantly, had become French. Yet her heart remained stubbornly German, attached to a land that no longer existed. Even the landscape of her memories was gone. The rivers, the woods, the castle towers she had known as a child, had been turned into rubble. It was said that when a courier brought her a painting of Heidelberg after its destruction, she held it to her chest and whispered, "Now my heart knows what it looks like." Versailles, indifferent to her grief, carried on with its endless rituals. While she mourned her homeland, the courtiers prepared for masquerades and fireworks. Louis XIV was still the Sun King, and sorrow was forbidden in his orbit. When Liselotte appeared in public with red eyes, one duchess whispered, "Madame weeps for peasants." How quaint. That cruelty only deepened her contempt for the French elite. "They pity dogs more than men," she wrote, "and flatter kings more than God." From that moment, her letters changed. They became darker, heavier, tinged with something like prophecy. She no longer simply described court gossip, she dissected it. Her observations were no longer the witty remarks of an amused outsider, but the moral reflections of a wounded witness. "They have taught me," she wrote, "that civilization without compassion is just another form of barbarism." Her health began to suffer. The grief lodged itself in her chest like a stone. She developed sharp pains and shortness of breath. Doctors at court dismissed her complaints as melancholy. They recommended perfumes, laughter, and dancing. She prescribed herself solitude. In the mornings, she walked through the dew-soaked gardens of Saint-Cloud, where the air smelled faintly of lilacs. The silence reminded her of Heidelberg's forests. She often stopped at a particular bench overlooking the river Seine and sat for hours, unmoving. The servants said she prayed, but she was really listening for the wind to sound like home. Versailles could never understand that kind of mourning. To them, patriotism was an accessory. To her, it was blood. Every time she heard French courtiers brag of conquest, she felt her heart falter. She once told a lady in waiting, "They think victory is glory. I think it is grief wearing perfume." The war ended, but her sense of loss did not. The Palatinate would rebuild, but the Heidelberg of her childhood, the laughter, the simplicity, the freedom, was gone forever. Even her family ties with Germany began to fade. Letters from home became rarer. Cousins who once adored her now viewed her as complicit in the destruction. "You have chosen France over us," one relative wrote. "Do not mourn what you helped to burn." That accusation wounded her more deeply than any French insult ever could. For days she refused to eat. When she finally returned to her writing desk, she began a new letter to her Aunt Sophia, one that would later become one of her most quoted. "They have burned my country, but they cannot burn my truth. If my heart must live between two ruins, then I will fill the space with words." And she did. Her letters multiplied, hundreds, then thousands. They became her new homeland, a paper refuge where her voice could exist freely. In them she kept Germany alive, its humor, its sincerity, its blunt wisdom. Through ink, she rebuilt what fire had destroyed. Yet the body pays for what the soul endures. Her chest pains worsened. Her breathing grew shallow. Sometimes she fainted while writing, only to awaken and continue where she left off. Her maids begged her to rest. She only smiled weakly. "If I stop," she said, "I will disappear." And perhaps she meant it literally. Writing was not just memory for her, it was survival. The woman who had once bridged two nations now belonged to neither. Versailles saw her as an artifact, Germany as a traitor. Between the two, she became her own country, a nation of one, made of paper and truth. The irony was cruel. The bride who had been sent to unite France and the Palatinate had watched both dissolve before her eyes. Her body lived in France. Her heart died in Heidelberg. And in between those two graves, Lieselotte of the Palatinate built a monument no army could destroy. Her words. By the turn of the century, Lieselotte had lived in France for nearly 30 years. Her hair had turned gray. Her laughter, though still loud, carried a weary edge. The bright, defiant young woman who had once mocked Versailles now moved through its corridors like a relic from another age. Still honest, still defiant, but marked by sorrow that only she could feel. She had given France 3 children. The first, Alexandre Louis, died in infancy, a loss that struck her with a silence she had never known before. She buried him beneath the marble floors of Saint-Denis and wrote home, simply, "He never opened his eyes long enough to see the world that took him." The courtiers offered polite condolences and swiftly returned to gossip. Life at Versailles did not pause for grief. The king still dined in ceremony, the fountains still played, and the music drowned the sound of mourning. Lieselotte learned that in this palace, sorrow had no right to exist. Her 2 surviving children, Philippe II, Duke of Orléans, and Elizabeth Charlotte, Duchess of Lorraine, became her fragile hope. Yet even motherhood, the one bond Versailles could not regulate, became poisoned by politics. Her son, Philippe II, grew up under the shadow of Louis XIV, trained from childhood to serve the monarchy that had humiliated his mother. Intelligent and ambitious, he learned quickly how to play the game she had always refused to learn. He flattered, charmed, and maneuvered. The courtiers adored him. Lieselotte, who saw the resemblance to her husband's cunning, felt both pride and dread. "He is clever," she wrote, "but cleverness in this place is the beginning of corruption." When Philippe II came of age, he inherited his father's title and his father's vices. He was handsome, indulgent, and dangerously fond of pleasure. The same courtiers who had mocked Lieselotte now courted her son. teaching him that deceit was diplomacy and desire a form of power. She tried to warn him, but he smiled, the charming, rehearsed smile of Versailles. It terrified her. Her daughter, Elizabeth Charlotte, was married off to the Duke of Lorraine, a union Liselotte opposed, knowing too well what political marriages cost. But no one listened. Her daughter's departure broke her heart anew. "I have sent another child into exile," she wrote, "as I once was sent." The palace that had once mocked her for her accent now treated her like an aging aunt, tolerated but ignored. Her husband, Philippe, Duke of Orléans, died in 1701, collapsing after an argument with Louis XIV. The king wept publicly. Liselotte did not. She had spent decades grieving him while he lived. She attended his funeral in silence, dressed in deep mourning, her face expressionless. "He is free now," she said quietly. "And so, in a way, am I." Freedom, however, was an illusion. After her husband's death, her son became regent during the minority of Louis XV. Suddenly, the son she had raised in suspicion of Versailles became its ruler, and her greatest fear came true. Power changed him. The boy who had once sat on her lap, asking about the forests of Heidelberg, now held court in the Palais Royal, surrounded by mistresses and flatterers. He drank heavily, indulged in extravagance, and used his position to feed the decadence of France. The courtiers who once despised her now praised her lineage, not out of respect, but because she was the mother of the regent. Her letters from this period tremble with restrained grief. "My son governs France, but he has lost himself. I raised him to know truth, but Versailles has taught him how to survive instead." She did not confront him publicly. She had learned that Versailles punished those who spoke truth aloud. Instead, she turned again to her pen, the one companion that had never betrayed her. In letter after letter, she poured out the sorrow of a mother watching her child become everything she had once despised. She wrote, "I see in him the reflection of this court, brilliant on the surface, hollow within. He is France, and France is him. No monument stands for that kind of grief. It is the slow, invisible kind. The loss of ideals, of innocence, of faith in one's own blood." Her health declined further. The fainting spells grew more frequent. Her legs swelled painfully from gout, her breathing grew shallow, and her once booming laughter became a rasp. Doctors prescribed endless purges and scented waters, but nothing eased her fatigue. She began to sense that her body was collapsing under the weight of everything she had carried. The lies she refused to tell, the truths she could not stop speaking. And yet, she continued to write. She wrote to remember her dead child, to plead silently for her lost son, to comfort her daughter far away in Lorraine. She wrote about the changing seasons, about the flowers she planted at Saint-Cloud, about the old servants who still treated her with love. Her letters were her heartbeat, slow but persistent. "If I did not write," she once said, "I would drown in the silence." But the silence was already seeping in. Versailles was changing. The Sun King was dying, his once mighty court dimming into twilight. The gilded mirrors were cracking, the marble halls echoing with the coughs of old men and the whispers of new ambitions. Liselotte watched it all with a strange calm. She had outlived most of her enemies, outlasted scandal, and even survived the death of a king. Yet she felt no triumph, only fatigue. "When you live too long among masks," she wrote, "you begin to wonder if your own face is still there." There were moments, however, when light returned. She loved the laughter of her grandchildren, who visited her at Saint-Cloud. They found her stern but funny, her German accent endearing. To them, she was not the strange foreigner of Versailles, but a grandmother with stories about wolves and rivers and stars over Heidelberg. With them, she could be human again. Still, each time they left, she sat by the window long after sunset, whispering to the shadows, "Do not let them become like us." Her life had become a tapestry of losses, of home, of husband, of child, of illusions. Yet she bore them with the same stubborn dignity that had carried her through Versailles. She would not complain, she would endure. That was her quiet form of heroism. "I am the last echo of a world that pretended to be eternal," she wrote near the end of the decade. But even echoes fade. The world had taken much from her, beauty, health, belonging, but it could not take her truth. That truth lived in her letters, in the ink that refused to dry. And though no one at Versailles truly saw her anymore, Liselotte of the Palatinate, the foreign bride who had lost everything, was still watching, still writing, still telling the story of a world that had forgotten how to feel. By the time Liselotte entered her 60s, her body had become a battlefield. The woman who had once galloped through forests and laughed so loudly the courtiers winced now moved with the careful, deliberate rhythm of someone at war with her own heart. Years of stress, grief, and loneliness had left their mark. Her joints ached, her legs swelled with gout, and her breath grew short with every flight of stairs. Yet, through it all, she continued to write, her pen defying the body that betrayed her. Each night, she wrote in one of her final letters to Hanover, "I feel as if a stone is sitting on my chest. When I sleep, it presses harder. When I wake, it lingers. My heart has learned to suffer in silence, as I once did." Doctors called it dropsy, a vague word for the swelling and suffocation caused by congestive heart failure. They prescribed bloodletting, leeches, and endless purges. None helped. Her servants described nights when she gasped for air, clutching her chest, whispering that her heart felt like a bird trapped in a cage. Sometimes, she fainted mid-sentence while writing, her pen dragging a line of ink across the page like a heartbeat faltering into nothing. And still she wrote. Because to stop writing would have been to die in advance. In her small estate at Saint-Cloud, far from the suffocating etiquette of Versailles, she surrounded herself with her letters, her books, and a handful of loyal attendants. The air smelled of ink, candle wax, and the faint sweetness of lilac that drifted through the window. Outside, the gardens were quiet, the fountains still. Inside, she wrestled with an invisible enemy, her own failing heart. She spoke of it not as an illness, but as a punishment. "I have carried too much truth in my chest," she said once, "and now my heart rebels." The metaphor was not far from the truth. For decades, she had endured slander, humiliation, and loss with dignity. Every emotion she could not show had buried itself inside her, layer upon layer, until her body could bear no more. Versailles had demanded silence. Now her heart paid the price for obeying. Visitors who came to see her were shocked by her appearance. The once vibrant duchess had grown heavy and pale, her breathing shallow, her hands trembling slightly as she wrote. Yet her wit remained sharp as ever. "My body," she joked, "is a wreck, but my tongue is still seaworthy." Her humor, however, could not mask the slow collapse within. Each year, her energy dwindled. The act of dressing became an ordeal. Even laughter left her breathless. She began to spend her mornings in bed, dictating letters to a maid, her voice alternating between irritation and tenderness. Her correspondence during these years reveals a haunting self-awareness. A woman who knew she was dying, but refused to die quietly. "My heart," she wrote, "beats like a prisoner pounding on the door of its cell. It wants out, but there is no escape except the one I do not yet dare to take." What she feared was not death, but the indignity of dying in Versailles' shadow, becoming just another story for courtiers to gossip about. She longed for a quiet death, surrounded not by gold and mirrors, but by the simplicity she had always loved. "If I must die," she said, "let it be near trees, not thrones." Her attendants often found her staring out the window toward the forests beyond Saint-Cloud, murmuring to herself in German, her first language, her truest voice. They could not understand the words, but they understood the longing. "Ich will heim," she whispered often. "I want to go home." But there was no home left to return to. Heidelberg was long rebuilt, but it was no longer hers. France had become her grave before she had even entered it. Between the two, she floated in exile, her identity fading as her pulse weakened. In one of her last long letters, she confessed something she had never dared say aloud. "Sometimes I think the heart does not die of sickness, but of remembering. Mine remembers everything, the cold forests of my youth, the laughter I lost, the faces that turned away. It grows heavier each year, until breathing feels like betrayal." Her attendants prayed with her, comforted her, and kept her chambers filled with the scent of lavender to ease her breath. But at night, when the candles were out and the palace was asleep, she often awoke in terror, convinced that her heart had stopped, only to feel it thud again, painfully, defiantly. She told her maid Claire, "I can hear it, you know. My heart. It sounds like it's trying to escape." And yet, even in decline, her spirit remained luminous. She continued to dictate her thoughts on politics, family, and morality. She condemned greed, mocked hypocrisy, and offered wisdom to her grandchildren with the same clarity that had once unsettled kings. One of her last surviving notes to her son, by then the aging regent of France, read simply, "Do not forget that truth has a pulse. You can silence a voice, but not a heartbeat." Perhaps she was writing about herself. The courtiers, who once found her brash and unfashionable, now spoke of her with reluctant respect. They called her the conscience of Versailles, though few dared say it aloud. In her suffering, she had become what no one else in that world had ever managed to be: human. By the winter of 1721, her heart failure had worsened. She could barely walk from her bed to the window. She coughed blood into linen handkerchiefs embroidered with the fleur-de-lis, the French lilies that had never truly accepted her. Each stain of red was a quiet act of irony, a foreign heart bleeding inside a French emblem. Still, when the priests came to offer her the last rites, she smiled faintly and said, "I am not dying yet. I am only learning how." That too was true. For Lieselotte of the Palatinate, death was not a single moment, but a slow, deliberate unbinding. A process of shedding every mask Versailles had forced upon her, until only her heart remained. And that heart, though broken, still beat, stubbornly, defiantly, as if refusing to let the truth it carried be silenced before its time. In the final years of her life, Lieselotte of the Palatinate withdrew more and more from Versailles, the golden labyrinth that had consumed so many before her. She no longer attended court, no longer played her role as madam, no longer performed the gestures expected of a royal widow. Her sanctuary was Saint-Cloud, a modest estate of trees, stone paths, and wind. where she could finally breathe without the weight of ceremony. But Versailles never truly let go of those it had claimed. Even in exile, it haunted her, not through people, but through memory. She often said that she had not escaped the palace. She had only relocated the prison inside her own mind. Versailles, she wrote, lives beneath my ribs. I hear it even in silence. At Saint-Cloud, her days settled into ritual simplicity. She rose late, her joints stiff, her breath uneven. The maid opened the windows to let in air from the forest. She would sit by her writing desk, quill trembling slightly in her swollen fingers, and begin her letters. To Hanover, to Lorraine, to anyone who would still listen. Her handwriting had grown slower, heavier, the ink blotted by tremors. Yet the mind behind the pen was as sharp as ever. She wrote of politics, of philosophy, of how she believed truth had become a form of treason in her lifetime. She mocked the gossip of Versailles, pitied its aging beauties, and prayed, not for salvation, but for clarity. I have learned, she wrote, that heaven and Versailles are alike, full of courtiers, and God listens to neither. Her bitterness, though sharp, was no longer angry. It was weary, philosophical. She had spent decades fighting for honesty in a world built on illusion, and now, as death drew near, she began to see her rebellion differently. Perhaps, she thought, she had never been meant to change Versailles, only to record it. In this solitude, she began to forgive. Not the people, never the people, but the necessity of their deceit. They lied, she wrote, because to speak truth in that place was to die of it. I only lived long because I was too stubborn to stop breathing. She often sat by the window, watching the trees sway in the wind. The rustle of leaves reminded her of her childhood forests in Heidelberg. Before the war, before the marriage, before everything had gone wrong. Sometimes she closed her eyes and imagined herself walking there again, a young girl with flushed cheeks and no title. The air would be cold, the earth solid, and the silence honest. Those were her escapes, not physical but mental. When her heart tightened and breathing became difficult, she imagined the Rhine. It runs through my veins, she said once, and when I die, it will take me home. Her attendants learned to leave her alone in those moments. They would find her hours later, asleep in her chair, her hand still resting on a half-written letter. Despite her illness, Lieselotte never stopped corresponding. It became her second heartbeat. By the end of her life, she had written more than 60,000 letters, each one a piece of her consciousness, preserved against the rot of time. She wrote about food, gossip, theology, family, and war. But beneath every topic ran a single current, the search for truth. Versailles taught me, she wrote, that power fears honesty more than sin. These letters, copied and circulated among friends across Europe, became her quiet act of defiance, her way of escaping the gilded prison that had defined her life. She no longer sought an audience at court. She sought immortality through ink. In her later letters, her tone grew more introspective, almost mystical. She spoke of death without fear. I have been dying for years, she said, one illusion at a time. She joked that she had already outlived her usefulness. The courtiers ignored her, the priests pitied her, and her son, once regent of France, now visited her only out of duty. Yet she held no resentment. He governs a country that devours its children, she wrote. I cannot blame him for being consumed. What she could not forgive was the falseness that surrounded her, even in retreat. Servants whispered rumors about her will, visitors performed sorrow in her presence, and letters from Versailles arrived dripping with feigned affection. She recognized the scent of hypocrisy even before the wax seals were broken. Versailles, she wrote near the end, is not a place. It is a sickness that teaches the soul to prefer appearance over peace. To cure herself of it, she created a private ritual. Every evening, after the candles were extinguished, she would whisper to herself the names of those she had loved, her parents, her children, her homeland, as if reciting them could keep her heart human. Sometimes she would hum an old German hymn under her breath. The melody trembled with her fading lungs, but it was the one sound in her world that felt uncorrupted. Her attendants, listening from the hall, said she seemed calmer in those hours. The Duchess transformed into a woman again. In those quiet nights, she wrote one of her most haunting lines. "The body is not where the soul lives. The soul chooses its own home. Mine is far from France." By then, her eyesight had dimmed. Her legs could no longer carry her, and her heart swelled painfully with each passing week. The doctors brought remedies, prayers, and endless lectures about rest. She thanked them politely and ignored every instruction. She would not let death dictate her schedule. "If I must die," she told her maid Claire, "I would rather do it with a pen in hand than with folded arms." And so she wrote, until she could no longer lift the pen. When her strength finally failed, she began dictating instead, her voice faint but steady. Each word was deliberate. Her last rebellion against the silence that had ruled her life. Her final letters were no longer about politics or pain. They were about forgiveness. She asked her daughter to live honestly, her grandchildren to laugh loudly, her friends to tell the truth, even when it cost them. "If my words survive me," she said softly, "then perhaps I have escaped Versailles after all." In her mind, she already had. Even as her heart faltered, her spirit wandered through the forests of Heidelberg, barefoot, unburdened, and free. In those imagined woods, the air was cool again. The trees whispered her name in German, and the sound of the court, the endless chatter, the polite cruelty, was finally gone. That was her true escape, not from a place, but from an illusion. And in that imagined silence, Lieselotte of the Palatinate found what Versailles could never give her: peace. The winter of 1722 was unusually cold. Frost covered the gardens of Saint-Cloud like a veil of glass, and the river below froze in silence. Inside her dimly lit chamber, Lieselotte of the Palatinate lay propped against white pillows embroidered with faded lilies of France, a symbol that had followed her all her life, though it had never truly belonged to her. Her heart, swollen and failing, had begun its final rebellion. She could feel it, a slow suffocation from within, each breath a negotiation between the body and the will. Her attendants moved quietly, afraid of the sound of death settling in the air. Candles burned low, their flames trembling in rhythm with her breathing. She no longer feared dying. She feared only that she might not finish the letter she had begun. It was addressed to her daughter, the Duchess of Lorraine, her last surviving child, her last link to the world beyond the window. The letter was a mixture of advice, memory, and confession. She wrote of the importance of truth, of living without disguise, of refusing to become another mask in a room full of masks. "I have learned that power and love cannot live in the same house. Choose love, my child. It will hurt you less." Her hand trembled so violently that the ink blurred into small storms of black on the paper. She pressed the quill against the page, willing her strength to return, but it would not. The maid Claire, now gray-haired herself, took the pen from her and finished the letter under her dictation. "Write this," Lieselotte whispered. "Write, I haven't been happy, but I have been true." Outside, snow began to fall. The flakes melted against the window panes, tracing lines of water that looked like tears. By then, few people from Versailles still visited her. The court had moved on. New scandals, new mistresses, new lies. Louis XIV had been dead for 7 years. Her son, once the regent, was worn and disillusioned, drowning himself in pleasure and drink. The age of grandeur was decaying, and with it, the world that had once imprisoned her. Yet Lieselotte remained lucid, even radiant in her frailty. She joked weakly that she would die, not of illness, but of boredom. Her humor lingered until the very end, sharp as ever. When a priest came to offer confession, she greeted him with a dry smile. "My sins," she said, "are already known to the historians. God can read them there." But there was something softer in her that winter, a strange peace, as though she had finally accepted the role history had written for her. She had been the German bride, the unwanted wife, the foreign observer, the mother of a wayward prince. But more than that, she had been the witness. And now, the witness was dying. Her final days were quiet. The servants spoke in whispers, the air heavy with wax and lavender. Each morning she asked for her letters to be read aloud, the ones she had written decades ago, when her words had been younger than her body. She laughed at her own sarcasm, sighed at her past anger, and sometimes whispered, "Yes, I remember this day." It was as if she were listening to another life, one that no longer belonged to her, but had somehow survived her. "The letters will outlive me," she told Claire, "and that is enough." On the evening of December 8th, 1722, her heart began to fail completely. The pain came in waves, slow but certain. She could no longer speak without gasping, yet she refused morphine or laudanum. "I wish to meet God with a clear head," she said. Her attendants gathered near the bed. Claire held her hand. The priest murmured prayers she no longer needed. The last light of day slipped through the window, painting her face in gold and gray, a final reminder of the duality that had defined her life. She looked up and whispered, almost to herself, "How strange. The world is still beautiful, even when it breaks you." Those were her last words. Her breathing slowed, then stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, not tragic, not grand, simply inevitable. A single candle flickered, then steadied, as if the air itself was holding its breath. No royal carriages arrived. No princes stood by her coffin. No courtiers wept. Only her servants, the few who had truly loved her, kept vigil through the night. They dressed her in simple white linen, without jewels, as she had requested. Her face, in death, looked peaceful. The faintest hint of a smile at the corner of her lips, as though she had finally heard the joke she had been waiting all her life to understand. The next morning, the bells of Saint-Cloud rang softly. The snow had stopped, and sunlight poured over the frozen garden. Her body was taken to the royal necropolis at Saint-Denis, to rest among kings, queens, and ghosts of a dynasty she had both served and despised. There was no grand ceremony. Versailles sent its formal condolences, nothing more. The courtiers whispered, "Madame Palatine is gone," and turned their thoughts back to supper. But somewhere, in libraries and attics across Europe. Her letters waited, pages yellowed by time, ink fading but words still alive. Each letter a pulse, each truth a breath she had stolen back from silence. Through them, she would continue to speak about love without affection, duty without reward, and the quiet dignity of a woman who refused to lie. The truth has a slow heartbeat, she had once written, but it never stops. And so, when the courtiers of Versailles forgot her name, the truth she carried kept beating, quietly, persistently, through every century that followed. In that way, Liselotte of the Palatinate never truly died. Her body was buried in Saint-Denis. But her voice, honest, weary, unbroken, still echoes through the pages she left behind, refusing, even in death, to be silenced by the glittering lies of a fallen court. She had never worn a crown, never ruled a kingdom, never inspired poems or revolts. And yet, centuries later, Liselotte of the Palatinate endures, not as a queen, but as a witness. Her body rests in the royal tomb of Saint-Denis, beside monarchs who built empires of illusion. But her legacy lies elsewhere, in the 60,000 letters she left behind, where truth breathes through ink and defiance lives between every line. While the palaces of Versailles have faded into museum silence, her words still whisper with the warmth of a living voice. Candid, sarcastic, compassionate, unafraid. She was not the most powerful woman of her age. She was the most honest. And in the end, that was her quiet victory. A heart that refused to lie, still beating softly across time, reminding the world that truth, though often forgotten, never truly dies.